Hello and welcome to Power, People and Planet. I'm Kumi Naidu, and this is a series of candid conversations with activists and community leaders from around the world tackling some of the biggest challenges that humanity currently faces. Today I'm speaking with Alnoor Ladha. He's a political strategist, writer, activist. Alnoor's work focuses on the intersection of political organizing, storytelling, and technology. He was the co-founder of The Rules, a global network of activists, coders, researchers, writers, and others focused on changing the rules that create inequality, poverty, and climate change. The Rules started in 2012, uniquely as a time-bound project and an experiment in anarchist organizational design, exploring new ways of how to work, play, and make trouble together. He is a co-founder of Terra Valienta, Brave Earth, an alternative community and healing center in the jungle in northern Costa Rica. He's a board member of Culture Act Labs and the Emergence Network. I'm also joined by Sharan Burrow, who is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, a former president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and very much more. Sharan is a passionate advocate and campaigner for social justice, women's rights, the environment, and labour law reforms, and has led unions both in her own country, Australia, and is the first woman to lead the global trade union movement. I've had fun with Sharan together at meetings with, say, for example, the Secretary General of the United Nations, where we virtually swap each other's notes, and she would say the climate demands and I would say the labour demands, because we were trying to push this idea of a red-green alliance. So Sharan and Alnoor, it is a great, great pleasure to be with both of you, and I look forward to discussing this important issue of something that we have, as activists have to do, and that is, especially those of us who have been around for a long time. Why is it we are not breaking through and winning sufficient numbers of people onto our side, and how do we deal with winning over people in a context of deepening polarization? There is no doubt in the current climate, we are seeing deeper and deeper conflicts that are emerging, and we are seeing that significant numbers of people are not veering towards the cause of justice, but actually are being won over to fascism, climate denialism, and so on. Having said that, however, we see that statistical majorities in many countries actually are with those that are seeking justice. So how do we move away from the rhetorics and ideologies that promote zero-sum win-lose logics? So within that context, let me just ask the first question. If I were to put you on the spot and say, based on what we seek to achieve, activism is failing, what would be your reflection to that? And by activism here, we're talking about progressive activism, because, of course, there's all sorts of activism. Alnoor, can I ask you to reflect on that question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels strange going first in some ways with Sharan here, who's really an elder in the movement space and much more versed activist than I am. But my starting place would be to agree with you that activism in its current form has failed. If the measurement of failure is a commensurate response to the crises and the forces on the other side, the regressive forces of capital. And we can get into the diagnosis of why that is the case. But the one obvious starting place is that regressive forces, the right, fascism, totalitarianism, one percenter ideology, however you want to sort of describe what the so-called other side is, it's much easier for them to organize, right? They have one organizing principle, which is the accumulation of more capital by any means necessary. So, if, as is the case right now, 93 cents of every dollar ends up in the hands of the top 1%, right? So by definition, wealth creation is creating inequality. Every dollar of wealth created heats up the planet, right? So climate change is created by capitalism. right? It's not man-made, it's capital-made. And so in a scenario such as that, where the sort of power elites have disproportionate benefit in growing the global economy, the dominant ideology is growth, 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 right? It's the solution to all of our problems, according to the dominant worldview. And so it's quite easy to organize around that. You don't need a conspiracy theory. You don't need the Bilderbergs and Davos, and these convening spaces are spaces to figure out how do we grow the global economy. And what they're also good at is making it seem benevolent. They will do more philanthropy, and at Davos, climate change is on the agenda, and the protection of indigenous rights. And it's hard to discern what they're doing when the majority of people believe growth is a good thing, right? And so that's what we're up against on the right, and it's much easier for them to organize. And then, of course, I don't know if we can even call it the left anymore, but progressive movements have, especially in the U.S., have degraded into identity politics and self-policing and canceling, and so the culture of activism has degenerated in many ways, and the sort of the solidarity that used to bind progressive movements is now fracturing, and at the same time, the scale of the problems we're facing are in a magnitude that when traditional organizing, community organizing, protests, when these sort of methods were invented, the scale of the problem was completely different. And so that's the world we're in. And then, maybe the last thing to say is we add the kind of spiritual element of this. In the very common frame in psychology is what we don't heal in ourselves, we transmit to others. And we see this on the left, right? And in progressive movements. There's a poet, activist, Nigerian man named Bayo Akomolafe who says, part of the crisis is the way we're responding to the crisis as activists. We think we're solving the problem, but we continue to contribute to the us versus them binaries and the degradation of sort of discourse and care.
Thank you very much, Alnoor. I want to come back to us versus them, but also how do we think about solutions? And Sharan, before I ask you to respond to the same question, I just wanted to clarify for people listening and watching that, I'm honoring the activism that many people have engaged with for a long, long time. People have given their lives, as some of our friends, all three of us have lost friends in the struggle and so on. But just as we're saying to business, given the state of the crisis, it cannot be business as usual. We have an ethical responsibility to say to ourselves, it cannot be activism as usual either. And I guess part of what we want to try and do here is to also not repeat the same mistakes we've made all the time and look at what we can do differently. So it's within that context. I say one thing on that. Yeah. Within that context, I should say that, of course, the world would be in a much, much more dire state were it not for the forms, were it not for the resistance of indigenous folks, trade union activists, civil society more generally. Sorry, Alnoor, you wanted to...
No, I was going to say the same thing. Like, the world without activism and organizing would be unimaginable. The question is now, what we're facing, how do we do it better?
Sharan, over to you.
I would totally agree with that. I was a little worried that we were denouncing activism because I'm old enough to have believed, particularly in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, I often ask young people, or older people of my generation in front of young people, when did your rose-coloured glasses come off? Because Kumi, you and I are of a certain era, and we went through the apartheid struggle. You were right in the middle of it. We were indeed supportive, hosting your brothers and sisters in exile, but we did win. People did win, the apartheid struggle. Now, we could talk about, with the Kasatu Congress on right now, we could talk about, whether we won. when we won whether we won the democracy or not, but you certainly won the battle against apartheid. In the context of that was the third wave of the women's movement, I can tell you that while our mothers and grandmothers had won the right to vote and won the right to work with limitations, it was my generation who fought for and actually established the right to work without harassment. Not yet, absolutely perfect, but the laws, the capacity to actually challenge unequal treatment. And so while we're still living through those areas of oppression, that would have been even worse for women if we hadn't have had that level of activism. And of course, in my country, we, the world calls it the American War, we called it the Vietnam War, but the moratorium in my country was certainly won by people where we, stopped young people being conscripted. Again, my generation, we stole out of school and then universities to, stand on the streets and challenge governments against the American dominance of that war. So, and we could go on. But I do think at some point we started to see those that we were opposing fight back. And the fight back has all the characteristics we see of today. They have the resources, they have the capacity to turn the law even, but certainly the technology against us. And I've been amused recently to be talking to the business community that does want to change. Well, whether they want to or not, they see they need to change in order to stabilise the planet, to create, greater shared prosperity, because otherwise you can't keep the current economic model, whatever we think about that. People don't have resources, they can't actually participate. And they're under attack. Woke capitalism is now the big attack on the multinationals that are working with environmentalists, are working with the trade unions. Again, not perfect, but the shift is on. And of course, it amuses me because activists, trade unions, civil society, we've been attacked our entire lives until actually we've won the day on some things, and then you become, the heroes. But certainly you're right, Kumi. We've seen many, many colleagues. They still shoot trade unionists in at least 7 or 8 countries in the world. And I know that you two know the reality of that as well. But we can't give up. So I think the challenge is what more can we do? And I know you want to get into that, so I won't labour the point here. But I do think that there is a real challenge for us to sit down and say, where do we play the insider role and the outsider role? And for trade unions, it's easy. We do it all the time. If you're just on the outside, it's going to take you a lot longer to win than if you're on the inside. But being on the inside alone in dialogue with whoever it is, governments or employers, is inadequate if you don't have the people making the noise on the outside, because there's no pressure or leverage. So we do have to look at our strategies. But I think really if you look at young people today, and I'm inspired by them, they're ready for the fight. We went through a lull, I would argue, in the 90s where people wanted a more peaceful world, so activism was questionable, even though none of us gave up. But I now think young people are there everywhere on all the issues of social justice, and we need to build that intergenerational mix, which will get us a broader reach.
Thanks, Sharan, and thanks for reminding us about the numbers of people that are perishing literally as we speak. And it's worth saying that Global Witness brings out the annual report now, which categorizes and confirms that 4 environmental activists per week were killed last year alone, which is a shocking statistic.
Absolutely.
But just to say that, I've been very influenced by a anti-colonial leader from Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, Amilcar Cabral, that said, tell no lies and claim no victories. And that's just what this conversation is about. And I thought maybe to make things a little bit interesting, right, Can we do a little game? If Alnoor, you go with, I want us to just spend the first 20 minutes now just like saying what are the reasons for, in a context of polarization, that we are not succeeding in winning over people. I'd like, Alnoor, for you to just give one of your reasons, and then I'm going to ask Sharan if you can say how you would respond to it, and then we'll go back and forth like that, if that's okay. All right, so Alnoor, let's take, what would you say is one of the challenges we're not breaking through?
I would say like a lack of structural understanding around capitalism itself. And so what the alternative often becomes is inclusion within the capitalist system, right? Which then pits us against each other in this zero-sum game of it's now our time to get some. And of course, this is non-dualistic. At the same time, we want inclusion, right? We want a fair economic system, but to think that that's the solution to the problems we face, that somehow black capitalism or feminist capitalism or whatever, more women CEOs or more black board members or what have you, is going to address the problem and the poly crisis, this sort of set of problems we're facing, is partly a historical relic, right? And the sort of antecedent of what's come before that, which is this mass exclusion, and it also pits us against each other, and it strengthens identity politics.
Okay, thanks, Alnoor. Before I come to your solution, Sharan, your reflection, and how would you react to that in terms of a solutions approach?
Well, I certainly agree that the global economy is not working for working people and their families, full stop. And it is about the extreme wealth, the corporate greed, whatever monopoly power, whatever terminology you want to put on it. So there's anybody that says this economy, nationally or globally, I would argue, is going in the right direction is simply wrong. But there are reasons for it, Kumi. People have never seen in Africa, your part of the world, a democracy dividend. Like when you look at the poverty, the things that we've fought for in terms of full employment, the questions about, cooperative workplaces which are growing, but cooperatives where workers own the means of production, as Marx would have said. But these things have always been put aside because people wanted a dominant model of economy that said the more wealth we create, the more the trickle-down theory works. It doesn't work. We know all that. So what's the solution? The solution is that we have to actually fight for the kind of shared prosperity. For us, we call that the new social contract. But you can't, just one example, you cannot survive against the current global shocks, whether it's climate, whether it's inflationary price spikes, whatever it is that's driving people to despair, health, education or lack of education, unemployment. We've just done a poll where 66% of people are worried about jobs for themselves, for their children. 76% of people actually say their income's stagnating or declining. In a world where that's creating desperation just to pay your bills, something has to give. So we do need new rules of the game, new economic models, and we argue that we need a new social contract. It is about inclusion, but inclusion in the dignity of decent work. It is about a rights-based future, both human and labour rights. It is about environmental standards. It means we can't build businesses if you can't actually reuse or redeploy the resources that reuse, redeploy or recycle the resources that you're indeed using. And it is about universal social protection, that people have access to health, to education, to broader care, to basic income when they're not in work. They're the elements that we need to fight for. What's the distributive mechanisms of whatever the model of economy is? That means people and planet are at the centre and not simply the greed of profit and productivity at any cost.
Sharan, I don't know whether you know the organization Alnoor led for 10 years, The Rules. And in a way, when you say the social contract, I'm just trying to connect both your experience. The social contract for me is about rewriting the rules of the commitments that governments make to their citizens. So, Alnoor, can you reflect on Sharon's response and maybe connect it to some of your experience about why it is so critical to change some of the fundamental underpinnings of how society is organized on the one hand? And then I want to come back to another question. I'll just flag it. Whatever that new transformed reality might be, there's a big question of how do we get from here to there, but I'll just park that question for a second, but I'll invite your response, Alnoor.
Yeah, and I'll try to connect it also to your first question of like, why are we in this state of what's happening, right? And part of Sharon's response is that ordinary people are not seeing the dividend of the current operating system, right? And in some ways the kind of rules of the system and how we could change them are not so difficult, right? Like Sharon's already alluded to a few of these, right? A universal basic income, for example, reducing work weeks for the same pay, would also reduce ecological impact on the planet, right? Putting a limit on how much the highest paid person in an organization versus the lowest paid person could get paid. The sort of alternatives, the solutions are like endless. But what we're up against is a lack of democracy in how these ideas get enacted. And in many ways, what's happening is capitalism and democracy are in conflict. Yeah, democracy says one person, one vote, and capitalism says $1, one vote. And so capital always ends up winning,
Yep,
right? And
absolutely.
if you look at what happens with this sort of machinery of this thing, well, and Thomas Piketty wrote Capital in the 21st Century, and one of the main conclusions of the book is that we're growing the global economy at 3%, which of course in it of itself is unsustainable, right? Requires a doubling of the economy every 20 years. And wealth holders, capital holders are receiving 5% on average return for the last, 200 plus years. And so the pie is growing at a certain rate, and those who have benefited from a head start on capital, i.e. White Western Europeans and people of European descent, men, etc., the sort of culture was created to reward a certain type of work, now have this massive head start. And so what do you do with that head start? Well, if capitalism and democracy are in conflict, as we know they are, one of the first things they do is that they hijack democracy. They start writing rules and policy, and we call it lobbying, which is the euphemism, right? In the US, they call it money in politics. And a lot of the research around this, the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard has showed that every dollar invested in lobbying Congress has a $220 return on investment, right? And so why would you put your money anywhere else? The first thing you do is you write the rules of the global economy to suit corporations and power elites. And then you have the tax haven system. So we have like $30 to $40 trillion sitting in tax havens, largely by corporations and one percenters, untaxed, right? So it's the equivalent of half of global GDP sitting there untaxed, right? So they've opted out of the social contract of contributing. And then what that capital does is it goes in and finds the cheapest labor, the lowest environmental standards, and then uses the World Bank and the IMF and others to force governments to have even lower labor standards, and so it's almost impossible to compete with sort of corporate power when you have sort of a system like this. And as I say, these rules they're just man-made, right? And they're changeable, and the alternatives exist. And it's not a lack of will, but something else needs to happen in order for these changes to happen.
So when you say it's man-made, I'm reminded of the measurement of wealth, which is a key part of the problem. And I'm draw your attention to Lorenzo Ferramonti's book on GDP, Gross Domestic Problem, the world's most powerful number, where essentially, if you chop down a forest and engage in a range of environmental destructive activities, that's a tick on the positive side of GDP. So if you have a measurement of wealth that actually rewards environmental destruction, as an example, right? There are many other things, including the violations of indigenous people's rights and so on, then you've got a fundamental problem. So what I think we've covered so far is the structural context of power that progressive activism is coming up against in this current moment of history is particularly challenging and requires some new ways of responding to it. I think the second thing that is clear from our conversation so far is that all of us have been involved in public mobilization of getting people to stand up for particular issues and causes over time. I would argue that if, given the scale of the problem we have right now, for us to win, we're probably going to have to mobilize on an unprecedented scale of mobilization that we have never seen, especially when we put the climate clock in the center of the table, telling us how fast we're running out of time. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to you now, Sharan. If you were to say one of the issues that, from your perspective, holds us back, and we looked at something that's more in the objective situation, I'd like to just say, is there something about the way activism organizes itself that is also a problem? Is there things that we are doing that we could do much better than we currently are?
Well, I think the base of activism is solid. We have to think about where we started. What more do we need to do? And, you know, if you look at the Italian elections, you just go, why?
Wow. Yeah.
Why would Italy, you know, with all of the attendant issues there, vote for effectively a party not too far from Mussolini? Have we forgotten our history? Or is it that we're not connecting with the people, with the communities that are feeling the despair? We need to listen more. You started by talking about Alnoor as a storyteller. I'm a former teacher. I believe very much in listening and telling the stories of people. It's how you motivate people. But when we talk, for example, about a minimum living wage, a wage on which you can live with dignity, that's evidence-based, you know, one of the most salient pieces of advice I say is you can do all the work, and you should have all the evidence, but in the end it's the emotion. When you say, could you live on this wage when you can't live on that wage? And people go, yes, please. And so then you can connect them into the fight for a wage, family by family, community by community, and suddenly you have an overwhelming set of demands. You know, we established a minimum wage in Ethiopia by actually finding a woman who was paid pittance, absolute pittance, by one of the wealthiest companies in the world in the fast fashion industry. And we made her a TV sensation overnight. And suddenly the Prime Minister and the Labor Minister came to our forum and announced they'd legislate for minimum wages. But that's a one-time thing. You know, normally it takes you 3, 5, 10 years, and staying the distance but making the connections. If you think from our perspective, and Kumi, you were part of this fight with me, we had to find a narrative about why communities would listen to us, why workers would listen to me about the transition we had to make for climate, the sorts of things Alnoor's talking about shifting the model, using the resources that are absolutely renewable or recyclable. And indeed, we coined the phrase just transition. Now, it makes my heart sing when people you wouldn't normally think would be on our team actually are repeating it. Are they doing it? No, not yet. But if we can now drive that conversation about what is a just transition into communities as well as our workplaces, then you can get people on your side. And by the way, our global polling shows us that, 76 or 7% of people want action on climate because they can see the devastation.
Absolutely.
So we start from a strong base, but making the connections, feeling and exposing the humanity in all of this. The reason we've got mandated due diligence now on the agenda, not yet done, but new legislation that makes companies responsible for social risk as well as environmental risk, is that we've exposed what Alnoor talked about, which is the dehumanising exploitation of workers in our supply chains who make the wealth of the 1%. But we have to find a way of having more in common with the people that we're working, to include, rather than just us with our academia. I'm an academic, so
Absolutely.
I'm not disparaging that. We need it, but, we've got to find the story and the connections for people all over the world. And you've preached that for a long time, so I'm not telling you anything new, but I can see where you get success when you actually take the time to listen and to repeat the sort of aspirational demands of others rather than just your own solutions. It's not easy.
Absolutely. And Sharan, when you said we are not connecting and we need to listen more, I think that we can own as something that we need to do much better at moving forward. And one of the things that struck me recently from looking at, like what we've seen in Italy, seeing the election of Trump and all the chaos that he brought and how he delayed climate action and brought many bad things over the 4 years. And one of the interesting things, if you look at the people that voted for Trump and the people that voted for Obama, you'll be staggered to know that there's quite a significant overlap, right? But this is driven by a lack of faith in establishment and establishment politics, establishment politicians, and so on. And people in Hungary tell me the same thing, that it's much too easy to throw in the towel and say everybody that votes for Orban is a fascist, right? Some of them are voting for things that, is very specific, that he's able to communicate in a way, quite often lies. I mean, if you take the Obamacare situation in the US, it was quite staggering to see the very beneficiaries of Obamacare were led to believe that it was against their own interests and started, agitating against it. But
absolutely, Kumi, if you think about it, we've tracked global sentiment, people's views, for 12 years now. But 10 years ago, we could see the declining trust in democracy, which frightened me then. It frightens me even more now when we're down to less than 70 democracies, because not perfect, but we don't have a better system. And many people have lost their lives for that aspiration of freedom. So, and I must say not all democracies are free. I think Freedom House says less than 20% of the world's people now live in truly free communities. So authoritarianism, if not dictatorship, is certainly the trend in today's world. But we said 10 years ago you have to be wary of this, and it was because of the lack of shared prosperity, the despair people were feeling, the anger to others, which has driven a lot of them and us. And people didn't want to know about it. In the last few years, you'll hear this narrative about lack of trust. But unless you go back to what Alnoor said about shifting the distribution model, finding ways to actually reward the dignity of decent work more equally so that people can, in fact, be optimistic for themselves and their children, then we are really on a slide into, not just civil unrest, but in some cases civil destruction.
And I think we in a very troubling moment right now. And, the election in Italy yesterday, but there are so many other trends. Alnoor, your reflections? And what would be your solution of how we can listen more and connect better?
Yeah, I agree with all that's being said, and I'm not sure like solutionism is the way out of this thing. Um, like I sit with that, and I think that yes, we have this this base of organizing and activism, and it needs to expand its toolkit. And I agree with you that sort of mass mobilization on a global scale is probably one of the only things that will be commensurate to the scale of the problem. And yet there's still a lot of work to be done in articulating an alternative worldview that unites lots and lots of people. And I think like labor and work and pay with dignity, these are the very strong grounds and a basis to do this. And merging that with the climate agenda, with also a broader sense of what are we moving towards, right? And I think that's the place that where I think a lot about and spend a lot of time, is that there is no uniting cosmology, right? Like beyond, in the dominant culture, beyond the kind of live, work, consume, die paradigm of capitalist modernity, there is no broader cosmology, right? And in some ways, because the simplicity of that ideology of the growth-based model allows the current system to organize. The alternative on the progressive side, or it's not there, right? And we have multiple perspectives, and that's also part of the beauty of why many of us love the discourse of the left, is that there isn't a way. There's a sort of much more plurality of alternatives that exist within a kind of anti-neoliberal worldview, right? A sort of ultra-globalization worldview. And yet, at the same time, some congealing needs to happen, some sort of uniting set of principles that brings people together, and the material conditions need to change at the same time, right? Because if the majority of people are just trying to keep body and soul together, how are they going to organize, right? And I think the current power system knows that, and it's sort of why, part of the reason it sort of keeps people disenfranchised and alienated, etc., etc.
So, if you take Alnoor's proposition that we have to get beyond the hegemony of one or, a number of solutions, that we have to really give people some capacity, if I'm not misquoting you, Alnoor, to make choices about their own lives, but ones that will give them a floor of economic and social dignity, then, another aspect of our world is the peace agenda. You and I just sat on a global commission for peace where we put both demilitarization and the stabilization of people's lives through a social contract at the heart of common security, the notion of common security. But, I was at the UNGA last week, and apart from the world of work, I was trying to argue this, that the world never comes together, Alnoor, in a structural sense to talk about solutions or ideas to generate peace amongst ourselves, to actually, stabilize the relations between people, because they're not fighting for that capacity to just survive. And so that was my challenge to the Secretary General. Can we find a way to create new peace architecture where, while it's not perfect, we do come together, argue, fight, talk about, demonstrate against climate transitions, but at least we do it and we give ourselves a chance to find a pathway through, or a number of pathways. But can we do that for a more peaceful world where common security makes us more generous and more thoughtful about a world where we're all interdependent, but we often don't recognise it because of, fear that drives xenophobia or whatever it may be.
I think common security is a very useful mobilizing agenda, even on climate, actually. For years, some of us have been saying that we need to turn climate into an opportunity of breaking the divisions that existed in the world and getting an understanding that we will only move forward if rich and poor countries come together and address this on a collective basis and so on. But I think the difficulty right now is that things are polarizing in along so many different fault lines. And as both of you have pointed out, that the democratic institutions and so on are also under threat. So what I think we seem to have agreed quite easily in, one of the things standing in the face of progressive activism is, if you want, the repressive state apparatus, army, police, use of formal laws and so on, that we have to contend with. Now, of course, there are things that we can do there in terms of being smarter to deal with repression and so on the part of activism, but that is objectively, a reality. And I want to do a little quiz with you all on a question, right? I think that one of the mistakes that activism makes is that we think that the biggest challenge facing us is, in fact, the repressive state apparatus. But I would venture to suggest that actually the biggest challenge, painful and terrible as the repressive state apparatus is, I would suggest that the bigger challenge is what we might loosely and others have called the ideological state apparatus, by which we mean the framework for education, the framework for schooling, the framework for the funding of arts and culture, and most importantly, the frameworks for communications and media. And I would say that has now got so stacked against even penetrating the ideas of progressive thought into that space, which is so dominated by fairly reactionary ideas quite often. And my guess is that is the bigger challenge to us today than, in fact, the repressive state apparatus. Any reflections on that, and how can we address this very complicated communications environment, which you already spoke to, Sharan, when you said that we are not connecting and we need to listen more. That took us in the direction of our communications capability to reach people is just not succeeding. Reflections on that before we go to the social contract question?
There's definitely power in a common narrative. It doesn't have to be a single narrative, but in a common narrative frame. And one of the things I think we can win on the climate front, Kumi, and we've backed it with, of course, the Teachers Union, Education International, but the campaign's being driven by, the Earth Care people, and that's mandatory climate education. If we don't actually share a common frame of knowledge based on science and experience in terms of the extreme weather events and the loss of lives and livelihoods where, people know of or have seen or have experienced these things, and that it's got a scientific or a knowledge base, then I think we're stacking the world against ourselves because we're not actually educating people about the reality of the world we live in. You could take that to other areas, the broader common security area, but just as an example, if we could all fight and win climate education, then, when you and I tried to convince everybody when we were losing everything else to get behind you at the Rio summit on oceans, can we win one thing, we were saying, then if we had mandatory climate education, then I think students would be horrified to understand the realities of our own making of the destruction of the oceans, amongst other things, but just as an example. So I do think we have to think, what's the most powerful base of knowledge that we can share that generates a common understanding, if not common solutions, but that broader narrative framework that then people will fight about or fight for because they know it's real.
Great, thank you.
But then I am a former teacher, so the power of education for me is still very passionate in idealism.
I can see that. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, the central role of education has come up multiple times in my work, and one of the books that really formed me as an activist was a book by a Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I'm sure you're also familiar with. Sharan, Alnoor, your response to that?
Your question is around, it's not just repressive state apparatus, but really the kind of social ecology media complex, right?
And I'm basically saying that today that constitutes a bigger challenge, or as big a challenge as any repression. And I'd like to get your reflection on how might we work around that.
The way I think about the dominant operating system is I think of it as a complex, adaptive, evolutionary system. It's alive, right? Not in the way an ecosystem is alive, but in the way artificial intelligence is alive, right? Or Frankenstein is alive. There's a sort of set of generative rules, and then those rules sort of create logical outcomes. Yeah. So, you create a system where money is printed at debt. Well, then of course your growth needs to exceed your interest rate for that money to be valuable. You invent something like compound interest, and then people with capital get exponential capital, and people with debt get exponential debt, right? And so I think of media or any of the industries, right? People think cryptocurrency is going to change the world, or technology is going to change the world. But these are all subsets of the broader operating system, right? Technology, science, academia, who's deciding on the research, who's getting funding, what messages are coming out in the media. They're all in service to the logic of the broader operating system. And what is that logic? Well, we just have to look around us, right? It's short-termist, extractive, rewards greed, life-denying, life-destroying, etc. And so in some ways, what do we have to do is to create alternatives based on values that simultaneously oppose and make that dominant culture redundant, right? So creating cultures of cooperation, altruism, solidarity, and also doing that at a bioregional level, right? Because that goes against the logic of the, whatever you want to call it, late stage capitalism, neoliberalism, right? If we let the logic of neoliberalism play out its logical conclusion, we would all be wearing Nike shoes and eating McDonald's and having Apple computers and Microsoft software, and right? It's a logic of monoculture. That's sort of what it moves to. So in some ways, the antidote to that is polyculture, creating spaces for other ways of knowing, other ways of being, other tongues, pluralities of approaches. And the logic of the system is one of globalization. And so part of the alternative is bioregional organizing and localization to create strong, resilient local communities and local economies. And then if that infrastructure exists, tackling aspects of this operating system, media, big pharma, big agri, big finance, big tech, whatever it is, becomes much easier. But when the only game in town is globalized corporate media, then it's very difficult to, the logical outcome is this post-truth world that we're in.
Thanks. That resonates very strongly with me. How does that land with you, Sharan?
Well, I mean, you can't argue against that at all because, again, it's monopoly power, whether it's communications, whether it's companies. I mean, if you wanted to look at how we need to change the rules, and by the way, Kimmy, and Elnor, that was actually a theme of ours now for, the common elements, building workers' power beyond GDP, a new social contract. You need to change the rules to deal with all of these issues. And if you ever wanted to see how it's stacked against us, then the fight that our sister Winnie's had, around vaccines or any kind of pharmaceutical products, including, the immuno drugs that will deal with AIDS, which people think we've eliminated and have not. But vaccine nationalism told us everything.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't about not having the technology. It was about the corporate greed that said we're not going to share the technology because otherwise we'll make less money. And it was cloaked in the most awful, I don't even know what you call it, but the language of disdain for others. They don't have the knowledge. We can't produce in other parts of the world. We have to be the dominant controllers of quality. It was just awful. But the same, therefore, on the basis of that, we got 9 new pharmaceutical billionaires in the US alone. And the scandal is that they actually grew that wealth individually off a lot of public money, a lot of tax dollars money that was invested in the IP that actually got us the vaccine for no return to the people. If I had to point to one idiocy of government, good or bad, is that they constantly provide, money for R&D, money for innovation. That's not an issue for me. But to not then have a share for the people who own the money is scandalous. So you're not making any returns, you're not even got conditionality. So that monopoly power, and now you've got the food crisis, you've got one company, Cargill's, for example, controls 70% of food production, distribution, about 11 billionaires in that family alone.
Wow.
That's not the basis of any kind of fair trading system, and certainly not of a shared generosity. But I do think that until we can bring some sense to the way in which the rules of the game change, that legislation changes, breaks up those companies like Amazon, etc., stops Starbucks, simply sacking workers who are on strike. Pick an issue. Despair is all around the world. And unless we can actually change the dominance and help those governments who want to actually have a more prosperous world, whether it's, deglobalization or whether it's simply a mix of, but determining their own future, then I think we'll see more of the same.
I think what your comments make also so clear as a reminder to us that the economic system is premised on almost a weird logic of we privatize the profits and we socialize the losses,
Yeah.
When governments
someone
do
who...
well, the money goes to the rich. When things are bad, the poor have to pay for it. And
Absolutely.
I think,
you take someone like a Bill Gates, who on the one hand is a philanthropist, on the other hand was indeed one of the greatest opponents of sharing the production capacity for vaccines around the world. I mean, that level of disjointed or hypocrisy of thinking is not anything about inclusion. I was going to say when Elnor was speaking that one of the big challenges we talk about all the time is the lack of biodiversity. And of course, ironically, it's also the basis in many ways of the pharmaceutical companies and other products, health, food, etc. And yet we deny the people even a partnership, let alone ownership, with the people who actually know more about diversity in our forests, on our lands, and that's our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
Absolutely.
We totally discard them. When whether you call it scientific knowledge or, historical, practical understanding. They know more than anybody what the basis of the biodiversity in their own communities are.
Yeah,
so we've just got to get smarter, more generous, and actually change the rules.
Well said, Sharan. We could talk for hours on this question. Sadly, we are close to the end of our time. But I just wanted to say, if there's one thing right now that you're most precious about in your work, what would that be? Let me give you mine today. It changes every day. So for me, based on this conversation, I would want to enshrine in any social contract the right of participation of citizens at the maximum level, including enshrining and protecting freedom of association, assembly, and expression. So that's my clause in the social contract. Sharan?
Well, I'm on that platform, absolutely. Dialogue, including people in the social dialogue that designs the future for a just transition.
Yes, and on the just transition, I want to say a big thank you to Sharan and the trade union movement, because in the way they framed it, it was never about only taking care of the transition of workers from dirty energy jobs to clean energy jobs, but it was also about the communities and the associated implications of the just transition beyond the legitimate concern of protecting workers' rights. Alnoor, last word to you.
Yeah, I would say what's sort of animating me a lot for the last few years has really been the post-growth agenda, and and with it is some people call it degrowth, but there's a sort of a suite of alternatives, at the core of that, which is of course different measurement beyond GDP, but also looking at the historical consequences of industrialization around the world. So we know the global north has created 92% of carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and the global south is bearing 90% of the costs in terms of human life, physical damage, resources, etc. And that needs to be addressed. And the growth machine of the system, right? As we were saying, 3% growth doesn't sound like a lot, but it's the doubling of the global economy every 24 years.
Yep.
And it's the first time economists and ecologists have agreed that there will not be another doubling of the global economy. Right? We do not have the material resources. We do not have. We've crossed 6 of the 9 planetary bounds now. It's just a physical impossibility. And so, how do we focus on well-being rather than growth? And the many places in the global north have the means and the ability to do that. And what it would allow is for the global south to catch up and have lives with dignity, economies with dignity, and then a sort of a global agreement on what makes sense, in what way do we grow the machinery of industrialization.
Thank you very much, Alnoor. Thank you very much, Sharan. That's a wonderful, your last 2 sets of comments, Sharan and Alnoor, bring us to a good conclusion. Let me just say, in wrapping up, that what is clear is that there might be challenges with regard to shrinking activism space, democratic space, civic space, whatever you might want to call it. But on the other hand, we are seeing the increasing level of young people's participation and so on, which gives us hope. It also says that we have to get better at connecting to people who do not agree with us at the moment, and we need to listen more and try and develop messages, narratives, storytelling, and so on that wins over people that might have been misled, lied to, and so on, to arrive at the positions where they have. So thank you very, very much, and thank you for all the work that both of you do. And thank you to our listeners and viewers for joining us for this discussion. Please make sure you follow or subscribe or like the thing there as they ask you to do. And see you next time. Thank you very much.